She has
She not
to.
here today?
So it was like both people called and said, we're not here, we're not here. Okay. Is Susie here today?
She's in the cafe.
Okay. We are. All right.
You've already turned on the recording?
I have. You want me to turn it off?
Yeah.
Yeah, turn it off. We're just wasting.
So it could be that.
All right, we are in Daniel chapter 5. First of all, thanks to Hugh for stepping in last week. Appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, dude.
No problem.
This is probably crazy.
We had a good time down in Florida visiting family, and I also had some business work, so appreciate Hugh stepping in. We had a nice time down there.
Great.
Florida and Mississippi and Louisiana and
Alabama.
We went through 4 states in 2 hours.
That's a lot of drive.
All right, Daniel chapter 5. So Daniel chapter 5 starts off with, let me just read chapter 1, verse 1 rather. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of 1,000 of the 1,000. So Belshazzar here we see is the king. We left Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 4. We now have Belshazzar, who is the king. So who is this guy? Well, it's actually a little confusing as to who this guy is. It looks like after Nebuchadnezzar died, his son ruled for a couple of years, and then he was assassinated by his brother-in-law, who ruled for a couple of years, and was followed by his son for 9 months, who was assassinated. And then some guy named Nabonidus took over, who was a royal, but not exactly connected to Nebuchadnezzar, not in the lineage of Nebuchadnezzar. However, he went ahead and married Nebuchadnezzar's ex-wife, so that they would be in the royal line, and she already had a son whose name was Belshazzar, who we're talking about here. So Nabonidus was not a very good ruler either. He actually was afraid in Babylon, so he actually took exile out to the western part of the kingdom to live, and so he needed somebody to rule as kind of co-regent there in Babylon. So he appointed Belshazzar as the kind of co-regent there to take care of Babylon while he was out in the western part of the kingdom. While he was out in the western part of the kingdom, his army was defeated and he was killed, and so it kind of left Belshazzar in charge of Babylon, kind of as quasi-king. He never really became king. He just kind of was the acting king, but in Daniel, he's acting king. He just names him as king here. So we got, so during this time, so Nabonidus has been defeated. I can't say that name. Nabonidus has been defeated, right? And the armies of the Medes and Persians defeated them, and say they are marching towards Babylon. Actually, during the time of this story, Babylon is under siege. The Medes and Persians have surrounded the city. They've sieged the city. But Belshazzar, he's inside Babylon. Now, you remember Babylon is this massive city, right? I mean, miles and miles wide. They've got their own gardens. They've got the river Euphrates flows through the middle of it. They can be under siege a really long time because they can grow their own food. They've got their own water source and everything. If you remember, they got walls around this city that 3 chariots could ride abreast across the top of this wall. So massive wall around the city. They felt pretty good that they were not going to have any trouble from the Medes and Persians. They could simply outlast them. And so you see in the midst of this, Belshazzar, again in verse 1, right, he decides to have a feast, right? He invites 1,000 of his best friends to come in and have this feast. They drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. So it's kind of amazing, really, that in the midst of this siege, in the midst of the rest of his armies being defeated, that Belshazzar just kind of sits back and decides to have a feast. So let's kind of also remember Daniel now is probably 80s, in his 80s. It's been 70 or so years since Daniel and his friends were taken captive. It's been about 20 or 25 years since the end of chapter 4, when we saw Daniel kind of step in for Nebuchadnezzar. So you've had all these other, weird people ruling, and now you have Belshazzar ruling 25 years after what has occurred back in Daniel chapter 4. So that'll become important a little bit earlier. So a couple things about this verse. He has this great feast for 1,000. That would not be unusual in that day. They say when Alexander got married, he had 10,000 people attend the wedding. So having 1,000 people there for a feast, that would just kind of be a normal day in the life of Belshazzar. You notice it says that he drank wine in the presence of the 1,000, right? This was a drunken orgy. We'll see in a few minutes. He was setting the example for the rest of the lords here, drinking wine in front of them, showing them how to drink, trying to drink them under the table. All those statements you want to make. He was having a good time at this party. I do want to just show you before we go a little bit further into this. I want you to turn to Jeremiah chapter 51 a minute. Go back a couple of books to Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 55. And really, there are several chapters in Jeremiah that talk about the fall of Babylon. So I could read several chapters worth. I'm just going to pull out one little section here, beginning of verse, what did I say, 54? 55. Or 54, whatever you want to start. Let's start at 55. It says, because the Lord is plundering Babylon and silencing her loud voice, though her waves roar like great waters and the noise of her voice is uttered, because the plunderer comes against her, against Babylon, and her mighty men are taken. Every one of their bows is broken, and the Lord is the God of recompense. He will surely repay. And I will make drunk her princes and wise men, her governors, her deputies, her mighty men, and they shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not awake, says the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts. Truly, says the Lord of hosts, the broad walls of Babylon shall be utterly broken, her high gates shall be burned with fire. The people will labor in vain, and the nations because of the fire, and they shall not be weary. So it's interesting, Jeremiah. Mine says they shall be weary.
Look at that look.
That happens to him too.
I don't have a mute button for her. So. Okay. So I just wanted to point out that here, Jeremiah, this is much earlier, right? He prophesies that Babylon will be taken down, that they will all be drunk when they're taken down, and that everything will be broken. And we'll see as we get into this story what actually happens to Babylon here. So we're seeing the end of the empire here with Belshazzar, and we're seeing the results of sin, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. All right, verse 2. So while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, which the king of his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So first of all, he tasted the wine. Again, this was another way of saying he's showing the rest of his lords how to drink. Right? He's tasting it in front of them. He's showing them how to drink the wine. He asked for the vessels, but notice it says which his father Nebuchadnezzar. I just told you Nebuchadnezzar is not his father, but he's definitely connected to Nebuchadnezzar. It's the same way that we would say Father Abraham. He's kind of saying Father Nebuchadnezzar, right? He's saying that he's following in the line of Nebuchadnezzar, even though he's kind of a twisted line, as we talked about a few minutes ago. So you'll see several times in chapter 5 he talks about his father Nebuchadnezzar. It's always in this context. So notice that they've taken these gold and silver vessels from the temple that was in Jerusalem. These have been, you remember when they sacked Jerusalem, they took all the gold and silver vessels from the temple They took them as hostage, if you will, back to Babylon, but they've been hidden and stored away, if you will, up until this point. So no one had dared to use them in this way, to kind of slap their God in the face like Belshazzar is doing here now. So now he's taking out these gold and silver vessels. He's pouring wine into them, and he's giving them to his wives, to his concubines, so that they can all get drunk and have this orgy. So it's a real slap in the face of God here, that he takes the gold and silver vessels that were appointed for the worship of God and is now using them in this drunken orgy that he has. So it is the depth of sin that he is in the midst of. Verse 3, you see that, right? Then they brought the gold vessels that they'd taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the God of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone, right? I mean, they're praising what these idols are made from, right? They're praising the idols of gold. He's praising these idols that are made out of gold, that are made out of silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Again, it's all about idol worship. He's praising them while he's using the gold and silver vessels that were set aside for God. It is, again, a real smack in the face. All right, then we see in verse 5, when we get to the interesting part of the story. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of a wall in the king's palace, and the king saw part of the hand that wrote. So first of all, it's interesting, it wrote opposite the lampstand. So, obviously there are lampstands around this whole feast area, but where this writing occurred was next to the lampstand, again, so that it could be easily seen, right? It was well illuminated. Not only the king could see it, but everyone else could see whatever this thing was written, that was written on the wall. And you'll notice also, in the same hour, right in the midst of their drunken orgy, this thing happens. It wasn't later on. At the same hour, God has said, "I've had enough." You guys are stepping down to the lowest point of sin here, and I've just simply had enough of it. And so he writes on the wall, and we'll get to what that's about. So then verse 6, then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. So the king becomes in sheer terror, when he sees this writing on the wall. His knees knocked together, he essentially collapses on the floor as he sees this thing. I find it really interesting that even though they're worshiping idols are really, they're the big deal, right? But all of a sudden, when something is written on the wall, all of a sudden he's in terror. Right? He understands judgment, whether he wants to admit it or not. And when judgment comes, and when this writing comes on the wall, he responds appropriately in fear and trembling from what he sees on the wall. In verse 7, right, the king cried aloud to bring in so first of all, the king screams, right, is really the right translation of this. The king screams when he sees this writing on the wall, and he asks them to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, right, so he brings in the same old group, we know them, right, we've seen them before. He says, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. So the third ruler, so remember, Belshazzar still considered, whatever that guy's name, Nebuchadnezzar, who is out in the field, probably dead at this point in time, but he still considers him the first ruler. Belshazzar is the second ruler, and so he's saying whoever can interpret this dream will be the third ruler. He'll be directly under me. When he says that, he's gonna clothe them in purple, right? This is the robes of the royal. He's gonna make him a royal person. But it's just amazing to me that Belshazzar does the same thing Nebuchadnezzar does. He calls this useless group back in again. and we'll go through it one more time here.
So Rich,
Yeah.
Russell didn't bring this up, so I will. Verse where it says that, where is it? Verse, in verse 6, where it says, yours says, and there's a reference here where it says his knees knocked together and the knots of his loins were loosed, and you said that he would collapse. Usually you say, does anybody's Bible say something else? Mine says he soiled himself.
Oh.
So, I didn't know if anybody else's.
No.
Yeah, mine does too. It said
It
lost
does?
control of his bowels.
Wow.
Okay, well, mine doesn't. Mine just says soiled himself. I figured that was, but
So the original actually says that his loins were loosened, right? And so the question is whether they're talking about his hip joints or his bowels. It can be interpreted either way. So.
well, you said it
whatever.
sounded like he was going to collapse, and mine didn't say collapse. Mine said he messed himself. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thanks for that. I really feel like that.
Well, I figured you'd pick up on it. You just kind of waited to see if we did too. So.
All right. So whatever. The guy's scared to death, right? That's the point of the whole message there. All right. So verse 7, right? The king screams. The party essentially stops, right? They're having this wild party. The party stops when the king screams. He calls in this useless group. And then we go on to verse 8. It says, now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known the king its interpretation. So you got this hand that's written on the wall something. Not only could the wise men not interpret it, they couldn't even read it. It was written in some language or some writing that they could not understand, even to read, nevertheless to interpret what was the meaning of the reading. So they're going backwards in their abilities here. So verse 9. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. So he's even more troubled now, that they can't even read. He's brought all the wise men in. His countenance was changed. He's got even more upset. Maybe this is when he soils himself, David. His countenance was changed, and the lords were astonished, right? All the people around him are just, they've seen the writing on the wall. They've seen the wise men. The whole crowd now, does not understand what's going on. And you can see that you got this party. It's a boisterous party. All of a sudden, it's turned to a very fearful situation. Everybody is confused. Everybody's fearful. And this is the world, right? This is the world depending upon the world's means to get something done, to understand something. We don't need God. We've got methods. We've got plans. We've got abilities. We'll figure out how to do this. Right? This is the world in the normal way that it operates. It never reaches out to God, who is the one who actually is the only one who can actually understand and do something about this. But this recognize, right? This is the normal way that the world works. We don't need God. We'll try to figure this out. We'll bring in all the wise men. We'll get the everybody who understands to talk about this, and we'll have a lot of talking heads on TV. Talking about how amazing this is, but no one actually knows what to do about it. All right, so then we have verse 10. So verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. So the queen, as we saw earlier in trying to remember where it is. If you go back to verse 2, you'll see that when he talks about Belshazzar, right, and who is he drinking with? He's drinking with the lords, his wives, his concubines, right? They're all drinking there together. So his wives are in the hall with him drinking. But all of a sudden the queen comes in. So the queen is actually most probably the queen mother. It's his mother, which could be it's either Nebuchadnezzar's wife or Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, one or the other. The lineage here is squirrely, but it's either Nebuchadnezzar's wife or Nebuchadnezzar's daughter who comes in. She's obviously heard. She's not in the hall, but she's heard the noise from the hall, certainly the scream and what's going on now she's heard. And she comes into the hall. First thing she says is, hey, king, chill out, right? It's going to be okay. She tries to comfort the king. Don't let this be trouble. Don't let your countenance change. O king, live forever. That blah, blah that's thrown in. And then she goes on in verse 11, said, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Verse 12, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. It's a pretty fascinating testimony that this Queen Mother gives, right? She quotes Nebuchadnezzar as a part of this, right? When she talks about having the spirit of the holy God, that's what Nebuchadnezzar has said about Daniel. So obviously, whether this is Neb's wife or daughter, right? She was in the presence and saw what has happened to Nebuchadnezzar. So again, it's been 25 years, right, since that occurred, since Nebuchadnezzar interacted with Daniel. But whoever this is was there and heard those things were said. So look at the things that she says about Daniel. The first thing, there's a man in your kingdom who is the spirit of the holy God. Could be who is like an angel from God. Again, don't jump to conclusions that she understands who the real God is. She's just saying that has a holy, lowercase spirit within him, and is representative of God. So again, this is unusual that these magicians, these wise men, would have anything to do with anything holy. So for her to say that he's connected to a holy God is an important thing. So what does he have? He has light, right? He has clarity. He has a clearness in what his thinking is. He has understanding. He has wisdom, wisdom like the gods, like an angel of the gods. And he mentions here that King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, right? He's kind of pointing out that Nebuchadnezzar knew him. He made him the chief of the magicians, the astrologers, and Chaldeans. So again, she's trying to build up Daniel to say, hey, this is somebody you should listen to. This is somebody you should pay attention to. Your father, Nebuchadnezzar, actually put him in charge of all these people. And then in verse 12, as much as he has an excellent spirit, right? So really, that just means he has an excellent mind. He has preeminent ability. This is not a spiritual statement. It's really just saying he's a really sharp character, right? Knowledge of obscure things. He has understanding. He's able to interpret dreams, solve riddles, proverbs, hard sentences, explaining enigmas. Some of you may have something there saying about the knots, right? He's able to dissolve knots, take knots apart and understand them. It's just fascinating that she has all these things to say about him. She goes on to say that the king actually named him Belteshazzar. He gave him a Babylonian name. Again, she's trying to build up that Daniel is someone that you should listen to, and then she ends it right, saying, now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. No question in her mind that Daniel could interpret what the writing is that's brought on the wall. So, verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? So again, remember, Daniel is brought in now separate from the wise men. They were brought in earlier, so he's not, at this point in time, he's not considered part of the wise men. He no longer has that position. So Belshazzar and all these other intermediate kings have come in. Whatever position Nebuchadnezzar has given Daniel, he no longer has. He's somehow in some other place. And so Belshazzar calls him in, and he kind of has to ask him, "Who are you? Are you this Daniel that the queen has talked about?" He doesn't know who Daniel is. It's kind of amazing, really, after all the stories about Daniel that you think would have been carried on were probably carried on, in the Israelite nation, but not carried on in the Babylonian royalty. They just saw him, at the time, someone they can use, and now it's a new ruler, somebody else. We got new wise men. We don't have to worry about this Daniel guy. But the queen remembers him, brings him back in, and so he has to ask him, are you this Daniel? It's funny, right? I have even heard of you. I am, that I have heard of you. You must be really important. The pride just oozing out of Belshazzar. You see it in everything that he has to say. All right, verse, where am I? I have heard of you, 14:59. I have heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you, that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and the astrologers have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give its interpretation of this thing. And I have heard that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. So again, Daniel's by himself. He's not hanging out with these wise men. He's brought in, and then the king, he kind of repeats the reward for the interpretation of this thing, right? We're going to give you a robe. We're going to make you third ruler of the kingdom. To me, this is kind of funny. Daniel's about to tell him that your kingdom is about to come to an end. And what does the king offer him? I'm going to make you third ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel's got to be thinking, okay, I'm going to be third ruler of the kingdom that's about to end. Wow, big deal, right? Whoop-de-doo. Thanks for the royal robes. Those will be good for me. But recognize again, this is exactly how Satan tempts us, right? It's a completely false temptation. He promises us, hey, I'm going to make you third ruler of the kingdom, but there's no kingdom. There's no kingdom to be third ruler of. I'm going to promise you all this stuff. I'm going to promise you that, everyone's going to love you. Everything's going to go great. Everything's going to be incredible if you'll just do what I want you to do. If you just fall in line with the world, if you'll just look good to the world, everything is going to be amazing. And there's no kingdom there, right? We are part of a different kingdom entirely. The world is trying to get us locked into their kingdom and their rewards and what's great for them, right? And it's exactly the same. It's Satan acting exactly the same here to Daniel as he acts with us. So don't miss that in the midst of this. All right. So verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. I got to say, this is a pretty gutsy thing for Daniel to do here. He's not doing the, oh, king, how wonderful you are, blah, 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 right? He just goes in and says, listen, I don't want your junk, okay? I don't need your title. I don't need your robe. None of that stuff. He's very, very stern throughout this whole writing here, which is just shocking, really, that he would, again, Belshazzar doesn't know who he is. He's just brought him in, and he has this very stern statement from him. Daniel's not intimidated. He's not tempted by this guy that essentially can wipe him out if he wants to. All right, so then in verse 18, O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. So first statement out of Daniel's mouth is, everything that you have, the whole kingdom, the broad, amazing kingdom, right? I mean, this kingdom was essentially the whole known world at this time. This whole kingdom has been given to you by God. The Most High God gave it to Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the kingdom, the majesty, the glory, the honor, all of that stuff. And you remember Nebuchadnezzar had to go through his time to understand that, right? He had to be turned into a beast in the field, blah, 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 in order to actually understand that. And now in verse 19, because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples Nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. Whomever he wished, he put down. Essentially, he was, he was an absolute monarch, right? He could do whatever he wanted. But again, because of what was given to him, right? It's because God gave that to him, he was able to act this way. God allowed him to be the monarch. God allowed him to have that honor, that glory during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And then verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him, right? So this is kind of redoing chapter 4. He's just kind of reminding Belshazzar what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 21, then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts. His dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. So again, he repeats that phrase that we saw in chapter 4 like 3 times, right? That's why Nebuchadnezzar went through that time, right? So that he would understand that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men. And so Daniel here is reminding Belshazzar that's what he went through in order for him to make this understanding. And now we go to verse 22. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. Right? I mean, he is slapping him right in the face. He's reminding him of the story and said, you knew this. You knew everything that has happened to Nebuchadnezzar, and still you lifted yourself up. You have not humbled your heart. So here in verses 22 and 23, he kind of lists the charges against Belshazzar, and this is the first one, all right? It's lack of humility. You have not humbled your heart. You knew it. You're in flagrant rebellion against God. You knew everything. You certainly knew that, you call yourself a son of Nebuchadnezzar. You certainly know the story of Nebuchadnezzar and what he went through. And for you to just flagrantly, rebel against that is worse than what Nebuchadnezzar did, right? He learned as he went. You're not learning, and you're rebelling against. So I just want to show you. Go to Hebrews chapter 10 a minute, to a verse we looked at not that long ago. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 29. Got it? Hebrews 10:29 says, of how much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord, and again the Lord will judge his people. Right? I mean, again, because Belshazzar knew, he heard, he understood what God had already shown him through Nebuchadnezzar. Are you still there?
Yes.
Yep. Can you hear us, Rich?
Did you hit the mute button?
It's not. It's on his end. Oh.
He just lost his connection.
You need to pause recording.
Yeah, dial back in.
Begin with today, and so I don't know. All right, so where do I cut off? Because all of a sudden I looked up and none of you were moving. Were we in Hebrews?
Hebrews 10:29.
Yeah.
Well, we just finished that.
Oh, we did? We finished that? All right.
Yes.
So
All right.
23.
Hold on a minute. Hold on. All right. Yeah. So verses 22 and 23.
Mhm.
So, so again, the point is that because they knew, because they were flagrantly in rebellion, greater punishment for Belshazzar than for Nebuchadnezzar. Can also point to Matthew chapter 11. We don't go there, right? Where it says it's going to be worse for Sodom and Gomorrah than for you because you know, because you understand and you have seen the Son. So the first thing is they've not humbled their heart. And then in verse 23, let's read through it. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which you do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Right? So first of all, they've not humbled themselves. Secondly, they've lifted themselves up. So again, it's pride again, right? Pride jumps right back into it. They brought in the vessels from Jerusalem, so they blasphemed God, right? Again, they smacked God in the face. They blasphemed him. Fourth thing is now they're praising the gods of silver and gold, right? It's idol worship again. And then finally, at the end of the verse, notice what it says. And you the God who holds your breath in his hand, you do not hear or know the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways. You have not glorified him. You've not honored or glorified the true God. You've done all these stupid things, and in addition to that, you've not honored and glorified the true God, the one who holds your breath in his hand. So I got to just say, it just the arrogance and the sin of Belshazzar does seem to parallel so much our sin of arrogance and the things that we've accomplished, right? How we worship our own background, our schooling, our job, our schools, even our church, our children, and we don't give the credit to God. We don't recognize that all of these things that we have, all of these blessings are from God. We just think it's because we're such an amazing person. Because I'm so smart and I work so hard, therefore I have all these incredible things. No, it's because God decided that you were going to be blessed is the reason you have all these things. It's the same sin of Belshazzar. Recognize that is all I'm asking here. All right, let's see, in the time we have left.
Rich,
yeah.
But one thing I noticed in 22 and 23, he's pretty bold to tell the king what he's doing, because he could face death by doing that if the king doesn't.
Oh yeah.
So pretty bold.
Yeah, the most shocking verse to me is 29, where after all the things he tells them, he decides to give him a robe and make him royal and give him all these presents. Like, really? I think I would have killed the guy. Anyway, so it's kind of an amazing sequence of events here. Yeah, I agree with you, Russell. Pretty bold. All right, then verse 24 says, then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and his writing was written. So notice that the fingers of the hand were sent from him, from this God who holds your breath in his hand. He's the one that sent those fingers. Notice he makes that connection. And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upshiran. And then 26 through 28, he gives the interpretation. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished them. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So first of all, he couldn't read the words. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upshiran. He couldn't read those words. Many of the commentators say it's probably that it was written in Old Hebrew, right? A language that he could understand, but that the Chaldeans certainly could not understand. So he sees these things. So, which also says that it was written by God, right? Because it was written in Hebrew. And then he has this, and all it says is, number, balance, divide. Those are the four words: number, balance, divide. It doesn't, so what's the interpretation of those words? And then Daniel gives them in here, that you've been numbered. Your days have been numbered. God's been counting, and your time is up. You're finished. He's been paying attention. It's now time for your judgment. And you have been weighed and found wanting. You don't meet the standard. You come up short. So, any of you else know that movie, The Knight's Tale? Nobody?
No.
Yeah.
Nobody? Yeah. ET's seen it. Okay. Diana's seen it. Good. Okay. This is a great movie, by the way, if you have a chance. Funny and hilarious movie. But at the end of it, they use this phrase out of Daniel, right? You've been weighed, you've been measured, and you've been found wanting. It's just interesting that they actually quote from the Bible in the midst of that comedy. By the way, worth getting the movie. Anyway, so he says, your time is up. You've been found wanting, and your kingdom now is going to be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. It really does say that your kingdom is over. God has found that this sin that you have fallen into is of such serious concern that the kingdom will be taken away from you. So then again, verse 29, which to me, I just think the king is drunk, right? So then Belshazzar gave the command. They clothed Daniel with purple, put a chain of gold around his neck, made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. So, honestly, Belshazzar here, he said that he has to keep his word in front of these 1,000 people that are there, so he's going to do it. But it's got to stick in his craw a little bit that the guy's just told him that he's about to end. And then we have verse 30, and that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. So this is very interesting. If you look back at the historical reference here, again, you remember from the beginning, they were under siege, right? There's no way they could get into the city. They got this great wall around them. They got all the food that they need. So how in the world was he slain that evening? So if you look back at the historical record, what was really interesting is that the Medes and Persians at this time, what they actually did was dammed up the Euphrates River and made it go around Babylon instead of through the city. So essentially then they had this dry riverbed that their armies just marched right into the city completely, without any resistance, because, hey, everybody's in at the feast getting drunk, right? And all of a sudden, all of the Medes and Persians just march right into the city, kill everyone that's there, come in and actually kill Belshazzar that night. It's a pretty amazing story, and the connection between what Daniel has to say here and the historical record is pretty cool. And then verse 31, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So here it is turned over to the Medes and Persians. We'll talk more about that as we get into the rest of Daniel. But here you can see the kingdom now has left. The Babylonian Empire is over, and the kingdom has been turned over to the Medes and Persians. So I'm going to run a little late because there's a summary that I want to give you here that I think is really important. So what we see here is the fall of Babylon, and in nations fall over and over through history for the same reasons. And so I just want to go back and kind of remind you of the reasons that Babylon fall here. First of all, it started out with drunkenness, right? They thought they could not be overcome. They were drunk. They were not paying attention. They were all about pleasure. They had a pleasure madness, if you will, right? They were not worried about any kind of serious threat. They were in entertainment overload. So just see if this reminds you of any country that you know of now, right? Lost in drunkenness, in entertainment overload. It was all about immorality, sexual overload, pornography, sex as the idol. Every kind of distorted sexual thing was going on in that kingdom at this time. Idolatry, right? Man-made gods, the gods that man created in man's image, right? I want a God that's like this, and so I'm going to create that God. False religions, all of that. Blasphemy, mocking God in movies, mocking God with charlatans. I mean, the way that we mock God today is so reminiscent of the way they mock God simply with their silver and gold vessels. Willful rejection, again, they heard it and they rejected it, right? Willfully, they rejected it. They were unrelieved guilt, right? He was afraid when this thing happened. Why? Because he was guilty and he knew it. He was terrified of what was coming. Greed and impure motives, right? He's trying to give them gold and scarlet, for interpreting these things. It wasn't about understanding who God was. It was all about greed and impure motives. Materialism, right? It was all about the stuff. One of the commentaries made this statement. I thought it was interesting, and that is that we in America are wealthier on average than any kingdom in history. Right? Wealthier on average than any kingdom in history. It's kind of an amazing story. They had a false sense of security, right? They had this huge wall. We have this, America always wins. We've never lost a war. They believed in their own resources and what they could do. They had this false sense of security. They had corrupt leaders. All the lords were in on it. The wise men were useless. We have something called the media, right? The other thing is the decline of the family. If we believe that Nebuchadnezzar was a believer, we don't know, but he certainly got close, right? His grandson didn't even know who Daniel was. Right? There was no sense of family and passing on the values. The complete breakdown of the family, we see that. And then finally, the big one, and we've said it many times, but it's pride, right? They did not humble their heart. They thought they were amazing. Because of that, the whole kingdom falls. So it is the story of the fall of Babylon, but it's the story of any king, any kingdom, any group that sets itself up against God, and we certainly see that in this story. Right, I didn't give you a lot of time to talk. Hopefully you had a lot of questions answered during the time we were offline. Thank you all. I appreciate you running over a little late. You'll have fun. We'll talk to you later. What?
Next week.
What about next
Does
week?
anybody know?
Oh, do we have Sunday school next week? No class next week?
Plus.
Okay. No class next week. Don't be here.